Hello, this is Joseph Trust. This video is going to cover using DynaMesh Subtract inside of Zbrush 4R4 with imported objects. The functionality of DynaMesh Subtract isn't limited to just using geometry only created in Zbrush, but can also be used with geometry imported in from other 3D packages. This option allows for even greater control in generating extremely fast, extremely precise, complex objects. Here we have a radio that was created using this method. This radio consists of around 16 subtools. They were all processed in some way using DynaMesh Subtract. Now, some of these shapes that were used with DynaMesh Subtract were imported in as OBJs from 3D Studio Max, and some were imported from existing geometry that I created inside of Zbrush. Now, this process of using imported geometry can help increase the speed of your pipeline by creating these unified objects that can be shared across multiple assets. So these rivets, for example, they can have their DynaMesh Subtract files stored in another Zbrush file or as an OBJ, and then they can be used on other models. So this greatly increases your usability of certain items to create unified elements across your characters or across any kind of geometry that you sculpt inside of Zbrush. So to start off, here's just a quick reminder on how DynaMesh Subtract works. So if we take a basic primitive and then we remove a subtool from it, such as a cylinder, we get a new shape. And then we can take that new shape, remove another cylinder from it, and we get this new shape. And so going through this process of removing these shapes with DynaMesh Subtract in Zbrush 4R4, we can get these extremely complex, extremely precise objects that require little no cleanup, and they're done almost instantaneously. So here we have our final radio. Now this is created using just imported objects into Zbrush and using DynaMesh Subtract. Now I have 16 subtools for this object, and so if I isolate one here, you can see how much complexity and how much precision we can actually get using this method. So this object would have taken me days to model inside any other 3D package. But in Zbrush, in a few minutes, I can have all these shapes carved out. They're extremely clean, extremely precise, and pretty much final at this stage. Now I also have different kind of elements, so you can see you can use this method to generate all sorts of things. So like these little buttons here, we have volume controls, and they're all using the same process of just using these simple primitives and then subtracting out other primitives to get these complex shapes. So things like this, again, extremely complex on generating these shapes. Like if you were to come in and model these with edge loops and NURMs and everything else, it would take you quite a while. But this process is extremely fast. I also have poly painting on all these objects as well, and so we'll go through and kind of show how you can use poly painting in this video to kind of with DynaMesh Subtract to generate some interesting effects. So to start off, the first thing I'm going to do, since this is a precise object, I'm just going to load in the reference I have for it. So this radio is actually created by a company called Barrett. I'm just going to put this in and throw it in the spotlight quick. So here we have the radio just in Spotlight here. This is just an image that I found off of Google. It is made by Barrett, and this is the PRC 2080 radio. So this is just a field radio that soldiers would have on their person while they're in the field to communicate with each other. Now, day-to-day production stuff for a lot of military games will often require you to model these kind of elements pretty much exact. And so using this feature, new feature of DynaMesh Subtract inside Zbrush 4R4, we can get these precision elements generated extremely quick. So all these cuts and stuff were just done using imported geometry that were created and then just subtract using DynaMesh Subtract. So you can see just following a simple schematic of a radio like this, we can end up creating the actual piece inside of Zbrush extremely quick. So I'm going to go through and show how I created this object. So first thing I'm going to do is just go to a simple Polymesh 3D object and then import in an OBJ that was created from another program. So this one was created in 3D Studio Max. As you can see, it's just a jumbled mess of different primitives. So we have some cubes that have been kind of scaled to look like rectangles, and then we have a bunch of cylinders that have just been kind of tapered a little bit. Now these objects were kind of tapered to fit these certain elements on the actual radio. So this is basically a cylinder that comes through. This is another cylinder that comes through, and then we have a rectangle for the main shape and then another rectangle to carve out that inner shape. So just literally just setting up geometry extremely quick to generate these kind of carve operations that our DynaMesh sub is going to use. Now, one thing to note on this object is that if I turn polyframes on, they're all individual pieces. And what this is going to allow me to do is use this group split button over here on the subtool and split them out all individual meshes. Now, if you don't have, you bring in OBJ and all your little pieces are kind of the same polygroup, the quick solution for this is coming down here to the polygroup tab and then just hitting auto group. And what that's going to do is it's going to take all those elements and kind of assign them a new polygroup. And then now you can come up here to the subtool and hit group split, and it's going to split them all out into individual subtools. Now, the reason for doing the individual subtools process here is that we want to subtract each one of these subtools from our main shape. So it's just another way to kind of organize them. So basically I'm going to take this main piece here, and this is our starter shape here, and I'm just going to move that up to the top. And then I'm just going to put these shapes in order of the subtraction process using DynaMesh sub that I want to do. So main shape here, and then I want to subtract these cylinders. I'm just going to move that up and then pick the other cylinder and put that below that first cylinder. And then I want to subtract this piece, and then I want to subtract this piece. So just kind of ordering my shapes over here in the subtool palette to kind of go through the process extremely quick. So to start off, I'm just going to take my main shape here, and if I isolate this with solo, you can see I have a little bit of tessellation on these edges here. So I obviously didn't have enough tessellation in the piece when I exported out of the other 3D package. So if I come through here and just quickly divide this now, I'm just going to divide it some to get rid of that harshness that was along the edges there. And then I'm going to DynaMesh this. When doing this process, you always want to start with your main shape being a DynaMesh, and then you're just going to go through and using DynaMesh subtract out your other shapes. So the first thing I want to do is subdivide it some to get rid of that edge harshness, and then DynaMesh. So for this object, it's a pretty fairly good size. I'm going to try 512 resolution and turn my blur to 0. Turning the blur off will hold your edges a little bit better. If you have blur on, you may lose this tight kind of edge that you have already set up on this primitive. So just a thing to note, if you start getting things looking a little bit mushy, just make sure you have your blur set to 0. And then I'm just going to hit DynaMesh on this. And it's going to ask me if I want to hold these multiple subdivisions. I don't for this model because I literally just subdivided to get rid of these edge tessellation. So I'm going to hit no. And now this mesh is a DynaMesh. Now a good thing to do, or a good procedure to follow, is to check the actual polyframes after you do the DynaMesh. So this is going to allow me to see how much tessellation density I have across the mesh. So if I notice that these squares are a little bit too big, I can come back, change my resolution, and re-DynaMesh it. I just want to get enough geometry across the surface to handle all these complex Boolean operations using DynaMesh sub, so they hold all the intricate kind of details and shapes I have on these objects I want to subtract. So this looks pretty good. It's going to give me enough resolution to do all these kind of carved shapes out of it. So now this procedure of using DynaMesh sub with this method of having these import objects is extremely quick. So I'm just going to run through, we'll do the first one slow, and then I'm just going to knock all these pieces out, and you'll see how fast this process really is. Going back to the subtool palette, I'm just going to come through quick and change this icon that's on all these subtractive subtools to the subtract icon. So just coming through and just quickly changing this to these second icon here in the row. And now, basically, what I'm going to do is just take this object and merge down. Now, as you can see, I just have this shape merged into this one now. If I turn on polyframes, you can see that this object I just merged down on top of now has this white polygroup. So what this little subtractive icon is doing is it is assigning this DynaMesh subtract polygroup to the object. So this process can also be done here down in the polygroup tab, and there is a new option down here called group as DynaMesh sub, and this is going to do that same thing of actually taking whatever geometry you have visible and applying it this white polygroup. So using this little icon here is just another way to do the process. So basically now, if I have this object set up as a white polygroup, it's going to tell Zbrush that when I re-DynaMesh this mesh, it is going to carve this shape out of this object. So I'm just going to turn off polyframes and then just re-DynaMesh. As you can see, I've just subtracted that shape out of this part. Extremely fast and extremely quick. Now, if you notice any kind of tessellation appearing in the actual object here, it's because of the resolution of the object that you are subtracting. So if you want to do like smooth cylinders or kind of cylinders with more tessellation along the edges there, just make sure your object is smooth or is, you know, as coarse as you want it to be, because DynaMesh subtract is just literally going to subtract that shape. So here we have that one done, and now I'm just going to go through these real quick. So basically it's just the same principle, just doing this merge down, re-DynaMesh, merge down, re-DynaMesh, and merge down, re-DynaMesh. So there you can see that in a matter of seconds I have this hard shape, this complex shape, finished. It's made all these carves, it's set up all these, you know, intricate kind of areas on this model, and it's done. You know, in other packages it would take me a few days to kind of set up all the topology or all the NURMs or all the edge looping to kind of get the creasing and the stuff like this to work. So it's extremely fast. Now you may notice that there is some kind of, you know, tessellation around the edges here. Now this is all in relation to the resolution of my DynaMesh. So if I would have done this at a resolution of 1024, this would have been a little bit cleaner. For this object I'm not concerned too much because the optimal viewing distance in which you're going to see this thing is about right here on your screen, because it's going to be on the back of a character, and you know, you'll probably only get this close to it. So as you can see, that edge, you know, you can't even tell there's any, you know, that little errors on the edge there. But if you change your resolution up, if you have an object that needs to be getting more screen time or larger or more precise, just make sure you have this resolution set higher before you actually start doing your DynaMesh subtract process. Another trick with this is if I come here to clay polish now and just hit that, it's going to polish those edges up. So even with a resolution here of 512, if I do the clay polish on top of it, you can see now it has cleaned up all those edges and they're extremely crisp again. So just another little trick that you can kind of use with DynaMesh at lower resolutions, and then just go in and use clay polish to kind of polish those edges and bring that crispness back to the model. So now continuing on, if you look at the radio here, I have more complex shapes kind of to apply to this main shape. So I'm just going to import in another OBJ file. So I'm just going to choose the Polymesh 3D and then just import in my next file. And so this file is basically bolts and the other stuff that go to it. So here I have, you know, import in from another package, and you can see I just have, you know, all these kind of groups kind of set up already with these individual pieces. So this is our main bolt shape with, like, you know, the kind of bolt carves out of it, and then these bits here are going to help establish these kind of cuts and intricate details that are actually on the radio that will be kind of attached to this main shape. So I'm just literally now I could come through and just group split this here, but actually I want it in the main file that I started with, so I'm going to come back to this one, the one where we just did the carves, and then just append this file in. So now I have, you know, these two pieces kind of hanging out in here. Now I already have these pieces kind of established where I want them to go, so I'm just going to come to that second set of bolts and just do another group split on that, and that's going to split all these pieces into my individual kind of shapes. So if I go through these really quick, you can kind of see that the first step I want to do is I want to kind of merge these into this main shape here. So I'm going to take those and move that up to the top. And we're just going to do this one really quick. So this one, if I have both of them visible here, you know, I just kind of want to get this shape, you know, merged together, and then start carving out those circle shapes. So like, just you can see here, there's circle shapes into it, but it has that main kind of shape of the actual radio. So this one I just want to be a positive kind of add to my DynaMesh object. So here I'm just going to leave this actual icon, this positive function, not the subtract, and then just do a merge down, and then re-DynaMesh. And so you can see now I've added that shape to this other part. Now you can see here, you know, I'm getting a little bit of tessellation through here, so I'm just going to do a clay polish on this really quick, just kind of clean that up, and then just clear that mask. And now I can actually start carving out these other parts. So this part here is a gasket. It's the rubber gasket that kind of goes around the button here. You can kind of see it on this edge here. So this one I don't have to do anything with. It's just kind of a shape that's just going to be added to my radio as a whole. So it's going to take that part and move that down to the bottom. This one is my negative carve shape to bring, this kind of carve function into it to kind of put the kind of recess where that actual rivet would be. So I'm going to move this up because that's the one I want to carve out. And then this is the shape for the top of the hex bolt, and then the actual bolts themselves. So these will be subtracted separately as their own object. So for this one now, I just want to do that negative carve through here. So I'm just going to apply this as a subtractive shape. So this is that part to subtract out. Doing a merge down, and then re-DynaMeshing. And so you can see now I have that shape kind of taking form. And now you can see if I turn my rubber gasket on here, you can see that kind of fits nicely exactly in that spot. And now I just need my little bolts to kind of go on top of the shape. So these bolts, since they are separate objects, so I want to take this main bolt shape here and then subtract this rivet shape from it. So I'm just going to do the same operation where I had, doing before with this top shape and then subtracting down. Well, now I'm going to use this as the top shape and subtract this rivet out of it. So I want to make sure the rivet is underneath that tool. Oops. So I have my bolt, and then I have the actual hex kind of rivet shape. So basically going to the bolt now, and I'm just going to DynaMesh this. So right now I have a good amount of tessellation on it, so I'm not getting any of that banding, but I need to turn it into a DynaMesh. So just come down to the DynaMesh thing here. Now in ZBrush 2, if you have smaller objects, you will oftentimes have to increase your resolution more. So if I do this at a 512 right now and turn blur off in DynaMesh, you can see that I'm actually, there's not a whole lot of tessellation going on the top of this. So I actually need to increase that tessellation before I do that little hex bolt cut into this. So I'm going to undo that and re-DynaMesh at say 1024. Turn blur off and re-DynaMesh, and this is now going to give me enough information to hold that subtractive hex bolt top to this actual rivet. So now I have that DynaMeshed, I'm now going to go back up to the subtool palette, go to my hex bolt here, and put that on subtract. Now I want to make sure I have my main bolt selected, always double check this, and then do a merge down, which will merge that hex rivet into it, and then just re-DynaMesh. And so you can see now I have those kind of hex bolts created, exactly, and they're, as I want them, where I want them, and they're extremely clean and extremely precise. And so now if I look at this object as a whole now, with all the different parts kind of going at it, you can see I have that complex shape, and then I have these kind of hex bolts and the washers already established on this mesh.